っと知りたいバイオエタノール。
アメリカの農家さんの脱炭素に対する意識について教えてください。
Thank you. The awareness of decarbonization from the U.S. farmer perspective has increased significantly. And that's not only because we want to do our part to protect the environment, but it's driven directly by the needs of the ethanol industry and the incentives created by the renewable fuels standard. We understand that the feedstock production is very important to the overall emissions associated with biofuels, and these production practices and land use changes will have a great impact on the carbon intensity of the fuel. The RFS, or the Renewable Fuels Standard, created an incentives framework in which market-based mechanisms link to feedstock production with carbon intensity. This framework and other mechanisms have emerged in states like California, the European Union, Brazil, and even in Japan, where incentives are more granular and further reward reduced carbon intensity. And this is particularly evident in the sustainable aviation fuel and marine fuel requirements. Also, the 45Z tax credit, which is the last incentive created for biofuels and feedstock producers, it links the value of the tax credit to the carbon intensity of the fuel produced.
アメリカの農家さんたちが脱炭素に高い関心を持っているのは、環境への思いだけでなく、バイオエタノール産業のニーズや再生可能燃料基準といった明確な仕組みが背中を押しているからなんだね。環境負荷を下げれば下げるほど市場で高く評価され、税金面の優遇なども受けられる仕組みになっているのは合理的でビジネスとしてもやる気が出るね。環境に良いことイコールコストがかかるというイメージがあり、脱炭素に取り組む農業は収入面では不利なように思います。アメリカの農家さんが脱炭素を推進するメリットは何かあるのでしょうか？
Here, what I will say is that good for the environment doesn't necessarily need to mean additional cost. Agriculture is very context specific. So the most important thing to take into consideration is that not all practices work everywhere in the same way. So whereas in some places you can have savings, in other places you can have additional costs. So taking that into consideration, evidently there are things that reduce costs. They're better for the environment and lead to cost reductions, such as conservation tillage that reduces tractor passes. It generates fuel savings. So basically that is a win, it's a positive. Same thing with variable rate applications of fertilizer or pesticides. There's less input cost that reduces investment into these particular inputs, and they create additional savings. However, there are certain practices that can lead to increased costs, particularly because of the upfront investments that are required. And some of the examples of this can be cover crops, where you need to invest in the seeds and you have additional labor going into it. It may also lead to additional fuel consumption. So it depends on the type of practice that you're talking about that you may have additional costs. In the United States, we've had programs such as precision conservation management that has been measuring which practices generate clear benefits. And so, for example, optimized nitrogen rates and conservation tillage definitely are presented as a positive. Some practices, such as cover crops, may require incentives in order for them to be feasible. So it is important to understand that context matters and that good for the environment does not necessarily need to mean additional cost.
とても勉強になるね。農家であるベリティさんにも聞いてみよう。
Of course, there are benefits to American farmers. Not only is it part of our, us trying to be environmentally friendly, but it definitely leads to less carbon-intensive food systems overall and contributes to reduction in GHG emissions in feed and transportation and across more than 15 supply chains in which corn and sorghum products participate in. It also leads to more resilient agricultural lands and enhances the provision of ecosystem services and carbon capture.
環境に良いことイコールお金がかかるって思いがちだけど、実際はトラクターを走らせる回数を減らして燃料代を浮かせたり、 ピンポイントで肥料をまいて無駄をなくしたりと、しっかりコスト削減につながるケースも多いんだね。でも初期投資が必要な手法に対しては支援が必要だとデータをもとに分析されているのもすごく現実的で参考になるね。トウモロコシをバイオエタノール生産に回すと、私たちが食べるお肉や食品の値段が上がってしまうという心配はありませんか？
I would say that the reality of the situation is that there is a misconception between the connection that exists from increased bioethanol and a generalized increase in prices. It is not a direct relation because there is actually a multi-output system associated to corn. A lot of people wrongly believe that if you utilize corn for fuel, that is the only product that you get, and that is just not right. Whenever you use a bushel of corn, which is around 56 pounds, you're actually getting multiple products. You're getting ethanol on the one end, around 3 gallons of ethanol, but you're also getting other products that go back into the feed production system, such as distillers dried grain with soluble, DDGS. So you get around 15 pounds of that. But not only that, you also get corn oil, and you can also even get carbon dioxide for carbonated drinks. So it's a multi-output system, and so there's this logic that you're taking grain and at the same proportion that is just being taken out from the feed system, and that is just not true. The US has been able to demonstrate that we can produce more corn that can be utilized as a feedstock to satisfy the needs of both the feed industry as well as the decarbonization requirements of the fuel industry, and that is very important to take into consideration. Now, obviously, there are connections between supply chains, but ultimately, it's not direct connections. The prices of fuel in general can actually impact both corn and beef at the same time. And so those are very complex relations that need to be taken from a systems perspective approach in order to be able to adequately understand them.
食べ物になるトウモロコシを燃料にしちゃうとお肉や食品の値段が上がっちゃうのではという心配は実は誤解なんだね。トウモロコシからエタノールを作るときには家畜の飼料になる閉産物や炭酸飲料用の CO2 なども同時に作られるから単純な奪い合いにはならないんだ。食料か燃料かの二者択一ではなく循環や全体を一つのシステムとして捉える視点が大切なんだね。将来のアメリカの農業はどんな姿になっていると予測されていますか？私たちの生活にどんな変化をもたらすかビジョンを教えてください。
Well, first of all, I believe that the future of American agriculture is bright. Otherwise, I wouldn't continue to invest my time, resources, and capital in that endeavor. Just like anywhere in the world, U.S. producers and other producers from other countries do face challenges. But we've got to evolve and adapt to be able to deal with those. Those challenges are going to be primarily higher input costs, and that's for seed, fertilizer, pesticides alike. But also, the capital investments that we need to make are significantly higher. And due to cover those costs, we have to operate at greater economies of scale, which means some additional level of consolidation across the farm sector. But that doesn't necessarily mean that takes away the number of people involved in agriculture, or even to some degree the amount of production that can be achieved. In fact, I think it increases the amount of production and adds some more efficiencies. And we've seen this over the last couple of decades, not just in American agriculture, but in other countries, as the adoption of technologies increase. And in some levels, the higher level of specialization based on your geographic regions. And that's allowed us to definitely bring acres into production that would not have been used normally or have not been as highly productive. And it allows us to have a more circular system within our agricultural economy. So you have producers that are growing certain types of products that complement others. So as an example, we're growing corn or sorghum and using that as as feed grains into various livestock channels or going into ethanol production that in turn produces a co-product of livestock feed and dry distillers grains. So I think working together, we can find more efficiencies in those supply chains and to better manage those higher input costs and capital requirements. And American growers are for sure ready to rise to that challenge. We know that agriculture and food production in general is key to security of not just the nation, but just the global population and all humanity. And we want to do our part, but also doing that, we want to make sure we are cognizant and aware of our impact on the environment. Because if we don't keep our environment in the best shape that we can, then we can no longer produce at optimized levels. So that's important for us. And we also want to make sure that we still allow the natural ecosystems to exist around us while we're producing food and fuel and security for the world.
アメリカの農業も世界中と同じように資材コストや設備投資の高騰といった壁に直面しているんだね。でも農家さんたちがそれをただのピンチとして受け止めるのではなく、世界の食料や燃料、そして安全保障を支えようと強い覚悟を持って立ち向かっている姿勢が頼もしいね。日本の私たちがアメリカのサステナブルな農産物を選ぶことは世界の未来にどうつながっていくのでしょうか。視聴者へメッセージをお願いします。
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the Japanese consumer for consuming our products in general. As a grower, it's nice to know that you have multiple outlets and marketplaces to sell your products, but it also adds a sense of satisfaction in a way to know that the hard work that you've put into is then appreciated by those on the end use of it. And having visited Japan twice now, it's nice to connect those dots for me. So very appreciative of that. And we also know that the products that we raise, such as corn or sorghum, represent a strategic partnership that significantly contributes to global environmental sustainability and food security. Because if we didn't have continued markets to sell our products, then we wouldn't be able to, the prices wouldn't be supported where we could produce those products in a sustainable manner. So that's definitely a big piece of supporting sustainable food production. But it also helps the fuel production when we think about the connection with ethanol. It's very important to have that link because it's not just about food production. It's about all of the environmental impacts and the practices that we use, such as the no-till farming, cover cropping, precision agriculture. It helps us to continue to invest in these practices in order to produce those products as efficiently as we can and making every acre produce more every year. So as a farmer, thank you very much, and we'll continue to do our part to provide those sustainably produced products to the world.
私たちが日本でアメリカの農産物を選んで買うことが単なる買い物の選択肢ではなく、現地の農家さんがサステナブルな農業へ投資し続けるための大きな支えになっているんだね。私たちの行動が巡り巡って地球の環境保護や世界の食料、燃料問題の解決にまでつながっていると思うと、すごくスケールが大きくてワクワクするね。
アメリカの農家さんたちが実践している不耕起栽培やハイテクな精密農業といった環境を守りながら生産性を高め、コストも抑えるという持続可能な農業モデル。それは単に農作物を作るというだけでなく、燃料や副産物までが無駄なく循環する驚きのシステムなんだね。
なんとなく遠い世界の話だと思っていたけれど、実は自分たちの暮らし、そして地球の未来にまで密接に関わっていることがよく分かったよ。カルロスさん、ベリティさん、本当にありがとうございました。
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to offer more insight from the farmer's perspective on sustainable agricultural production in the United States.
Yeah, we're very pleased to be able to be representing U.S. growers. The U.S. Grains and Bioproducts Council carries their voices across the world and makes sure that we're able to satisfy the sustainability requirements that all of our partners need to meet, and we're ready to take that on.